There are so many different answers to this question, it could leave anyone confused. I've also heard some wild claims when it comes to succulents and watering. I've had people tell me on more than one occasion that succulents just never need to be watered. When I've heard this the first time round, I was a bit surprised, but since then I've heard a few different people say it as well. Not sure who is spreading this, but FYI, even succulents do need to be watered. Now, I get the confusion around succulents and watering. They come from arid environments, often don't see rain for months, and have evolved to store water in their leaves, stems and roots. One may conclude that once every other month or so would be sufficient. And it could work for some succulents, but could well cause others to die. The reason why it's not that easy to provide a consistent answer is that how often depends on so many factors. When I talk to my customers, how often do I water this is on the top of my FAQs. But in my opinion, how often is the wrong question. I know people like a routine and perhaps it's easier to commit to watering when you have set times, but when it comes to succulents, the question should really be when do I water rather than how often. And so in this video, we'll have a look at why the how often is so difficult to answer and see if we can get a somewhat ballpark figure. I'll also tell you how I water my succulents and why this may be the best way to make sure your succulents get enough, but not too much water no matter the type of succulent or climate you live in. My main reason for being reluctant to put a time on watering succulents and say water every 2 weeks for instance is the change in the plant's needs. To put it simply, succulents will need watering more often during summer when temperatures rise and less in winter when many are dormant. But even that can change because if the summer happens to be wet and humid, you may need to water a lot less than if it's hot and dry. As an example, the last 3 summers were really wet in my part of the world and the amount of times I turned the watering system on was in single digits. But before that, we were in a huge drought and temperatures often went about 40 degrees Celsius, which is 104 Fahrenheit. I had to water my potted plants almost every day during the summer months back then. The summer of 2019-2020 was particularly brutal and I remember having to get these oval tubs for my poor Haworthia that just could not stay hydrated. I filled them up with water and left the plants just sitting there. The Haworthia that didn't get to be in the tubs looked really sorry for themselves, developing dry brown leaves and tips. That was a dark year for us and I have this fear in the back of my mind the heat, drought and fires are going to return this summer. Anywho, the point is that weather, temperature and also the type of succulent can affect the how often. Periodic watering will not work for every situation and every succulent. During a hot summer, potted little succulents such as Sedum acre or Crassula pellucida could dry out and die if they were watered only every 2 weeks, while the more chunky plants like Crassula ovata will survive. If someone persists on getting a period of time, I'd probably say something like water outdoor succulents about once per week when hot, sunny and dry. Once every 2 weeks during mild weather in spring and autumn, and not to bother at all in winter unless you have Aeonium or Sedum. Indoor succulents will be okay when watered once per month. But I really do hate putting a time period on watering and would highly suggest doing what I'm about to say next. I use this method with my plants and to date it has not let me down yet. Basically, I water well when my succulents need it, which is once the potting mix has dried up completely from previous watering. Watering well means giving it a good old soak that will completely saturate the potting mix. In my personal experience, this works for succulents including cacti. Many will go longer being completely dry, but I don't like to wait all that long, especially in summer when the potting mix can get hydrophobic. Just a quick explanation, hydrophobic potting mix will repel water. You may empty a whole watering can into a pot, but if the mix has gone hydrophobic, it will just run through, not soaking it and therefore not allowing the succulent to have a drink. You will be able to see when you water and scratch the top layer of potting mix off. If it's dry and dusty underneath the wet top layer, even after a good soak, the potting mix is hydrophobic. You can either repot using fresh potting mix or soak in a deep dish of water. It will eventually get saturated, which will fix the problem. If a pot is quite small, dark colored or terracotta, exposed to the sun and the temperature is warm, you may find that the potting mix dries out every other day. If that happens, I water every other day. You can water with a hose, watering can, or by soaking in a dish of water. I would not recommend spraying succulents with a spray bottle. It will just not deliver enough water to the roots. The more sensitive succulents that are susceptible to attracting fungal disease such as rot or black spots will likely benefit from soaking in water rather than getting a full bath from a hose. You can also soak if you want a spotless farina. Overhead watering can sometimes wash a bit of the farina away. And my final advice is, you don't have to overthink watering succulents. Unlike other plants, most will tolerate even if you leave them dry for a good amount of time, and they have developed coping mechanisms for this. Same goes for overwatering. I have a whole separate video on this topic which I'll tag at the end, but basically as long as your succulents are planted in succulent potting mix, have a drainage hole and get a good amount of light outdoors, overwatering is unlikely to affect them all that much. Just play it by the ear. If the mix looks dry, then water. And on that note, it's time to end. I hope this video was useful, and if you'd like to add anything or would like to ask a question, you can do so in the comments below. To learn more about succulents, hit the subscribe button or go to succulentgrowingtips.com. Thank you very much for watching.